The coal burns where it touches her eyelids. Kia is 26 years old, and she can feel the cosmetic paste stinging the cuts that ring her eyes. Cuts made deliberately that morning by the household cosmetician, who explained that the small wounds would make the coal penetrate deeper, would make her eyes appear larger and more lustrous for the inspection that will determine her fate. She was, until 37 days ago, the daughter of a Nubian chieftain, promised in marriage to the son of a neighboring king, educated in the poetry of her people, and the administration of the household she would one day manage. Now she kneels on polished granite in the reception hall of Lord Senenmut, overseer of the royal granaries, a man whose wealth is measured in fields that stretch beyond the horizon and slaves who number in the hundreds. Around her, 11 other women kneel in identical positions, wrists bound behind their backs, bodies oiled until their skin gleams in the lamplight, faces painted with cosmetics designed to enhance their value. They are merchandise. They are being evaluated. Lord Senenmut walks among them slowly, his linen robes brushing against skin as he passes, his eyes assessing flesh, the way she has seen cattle traders assess livestock. He is perhaps 50 years old, his body soft from decades of wealth, his face bearing the particular expression of someone who has never been denied anything he wanted. Behind him, his steward takes notes on papyrus, recording observations that will influence which women go where, which purposes each will serve. "This one," Senenmut says, stopping before Kia. Nubian, "The features are good. The body is." He gestures, and a servant steps forward to pull away the thin cloth that provides her only covering. Acceptable, strong enough for labor, refined enough for display. What is her background? Chieftain's daughter, my lord, captured in the Southern Campaign. She is literate in her own tongue and has some Egyptian. Literate. The word carries weight. That limits her uses but increases certain values. She could serve in administrative capacities. She could be trained for the innermost household. The innermost household. Kia has been in Egypt long enough to understand what that phrase means. The women who serve there do not merely clean and cook. They provide services that the formal wife cannot or will not provide. They bear children who will never inherit, but who will carry their father's blood. They exist in a space between slave and concubine, protected by proximity to power, but destroyed by that same proximity when power's attention shifts elsewhere. "I will take this one personally," Senenmut continues. "Prepare her for my quarters this evening. The standard preparation." The standard preparation, another phrase she has learned to fear. It involves bathing, perfuming, the application of oils and cosmetics that will make her body more pleasing to touch, more aromatic to smell, more visually appealing in the lamplight where she will be expected to perform. A woman approaches older, perhaps 40, wearing the simple dress of a senior household servant, but carrying herself with an authority that suggests her position is more complex than her clothing indicates. She takes Kia's arm and guides her to her feet with a grip that is firm but not cruel. "Come," the woman says in Egyptian that carries a Nubian accent. "I will explain what you need to understand." She is led from the reception hall through corridors that grow progressively more private, more richly decorated, more clearly belonging to the innermost household that will be her new world. The woman walking beside her says nothing until they reach a small chamber where bathing implements have been arranged. "My name is Merit," the woman says. "I was where you are 22 years ago. I am going to tell you things that will determine whether you survive the next year or whether you become one of the women we never speak of again. What you are about to learn has been systematically excluded from the histories that celebrate ancient Egypt as a civilization of grandeur and achievement. The pyramids, the temples, the magnificent tombs of the pharaohs, these are what we remember. The monuments tell stories of divine kings and eternal life, of power wielded righteously, and culture preserved across millennia. But monuments are built by hands that history does not record. Palaces are maintained by bodies that hieroglyphics do not name. And the great households of Egyptian nobles, the estates that produced the wealth that funded the monuments, were sustained by enslaved women whose experiences have been erased from the historical record as thoroughly as if they had never existed. Tonight, you will learn what happened inside those households. You will learn about the systems that governed enslaved women's lives, the hierarchies that determined their fates, the methods of control that were refined over centuries of practice. You will learn about the innermost household and what service there actually meant. You will learn about Kia, a Nubian chieftain's daughter, who entered the household of Lord Senenmut as property, and who spent the next 30 years navigating a system designed to consume women like her. You will learn what she endured, what she witnessed, what she eventually became when the system that should have destroyed her instead transformed her into something else entirely. Subscribe if you want to understand the full complexity of ancient Egyptian society, not the simplified version that focuses on monuments and mysteries, but the human reality of a civilization built on the labor and suffering of enslaved people. Comment below telling me where you are watching from, because Kia is about to enter the innermost household of one of Egypt's most powerful nobles, and I am going to tell you exactly what that entrance required. But before I describe what happened to her that first night, and in the years that followed, I need to take you back. I need to explain how Egyptian slavery functioned, why enslaved women faced particular horrors, and what the innermost household actually was. Because you cannot understand what Kia experienced without understanding the system that shaped her existence. Egyptian slavery was not a single institution, but a spectrum of unfreedom that varied enormously depending on circumstances. At one end were debt bondsmen, Egyptians who had fallen into temporary servitude to pay off obligations, who retained legal rights and could eventually purchase their freedom. At the other end were war captives from foreign lands, Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics, peoples whose conquest had stripped them of all status and delivered them into a bondage that was permanent and hereditary. Women occupied particular positions within this spectrum. Female slaves were valued for multiple capacities simultaneously as laborers who could perform domestic and agricultural work, as producers who could bear children to increase a household's slave population, and as objects of sexual access whose bodies belonged to their owners as completely as any other property. The Egyptian language had multiple words for these different functions. A hemet was a female servant who performed domestic labor. A sekmet was a woman designated for sexual use by her owner. A meret was a woman whose primary purpose was producing children. Many enslaved women were classified under multiple terms simultaneously, expected to fulfill all these functions as their owners demanded. The great households of the nobility organized these women into hierarchies that determined their living conditions, their daily experiences, and their prospects for whatever limited advancement the system permitted. At the bottom were field workers and general laborers, women who slept in communal quarters and whose bodies were available to overseers and fellow slaves without restriction. Above them were domestic servants who worked within the house itself, whose conditions were somewhat better but whose bodies remained property accessible to any man with sufficient authority. At the top, if top is the appropriate word for a hierarchy of degradation, were the women of the innermost household. These were the personal servants of the Lord himself, selected for beauty, intelligence, and the capacity to provide services that went beyond simple labor. They slept in quarters adjacent to the Lord's chambers. They ate better food, wore better clothing, received medical attention that other slaves were denied. They were, in some ways, the most privileged of the enslaved. But their privilege was inseparable from their function. They existed to serve the Lord's personal needs, not merely sexual needs, though those were central, but also the needs for entertainment, for companionship, for the particular kind of submission that made powerful men feel more powerful. Their proximity to power protected them from some abuses while exposing them to others. They were simultaneously the most valued and the most vulnerable women in the household. This was the world Kia was entering. This was the system that would shape her existence for the next 3 decades. Now let us return to the bathing chamber, where Merritt is preparing Kia for her first night in Lord Senenmut's service. "You have a choice," Merritt said, her hands working oil into Kia's skin with practiced efficiency. "Not the choice you want, not the choice to leave, or to refuse, or to be treated as a human being rather than property, but a choice nonetheless. What choice? How you respond, how you position yourself, whether you remain a victim of this system or learn to navigate it, to use it, to eventually make it serve purposes. It was never designed to serve." Kia looked at the older woman. Merritt's face bore the subtle signs of long-suffering lines around the mouth that suggested years of suppressing expression, a carefulness in the eyes that came from constant vigilance. But there was also something else. Confidence. The bearing of someone who had achieved a position of security within a system that offered no security.